I'm Keaton Fletcher, an assistant professor of industrial organizational psychology at Colorado State University.
And I'm Mariana Arvon, an organizational psychologist who specializes in organization and talent development.
And this is Healthy Work.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Healthy Work. I am excited to be joined today by Associate Professor Dr. Kimberly French. Will you introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you. I'm Kimberly French. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Colorado State University.
And this is not your first time on the podcast. We're excited to have you back. You recently published a paper in the Journal of Applied Psychology on stressor accumulation. And so I would love it if you could just give us a brief overview of that paper and what you found.
Sure. So this paper was with my fantastic colleagues, Claire Smith, Sumi Lee, and Chris Chen. And we were really interested in this process of stressor pileup. So the idea that we don't just experience like a stressor in isolation, but rather in life, we experience stressors each and every day, and kind of the previous stressors might pile up on or color our experiences of the subsequent stressors, right? So if I had a really hard time getting my kids out the door this morning, that might affect the way that I experience, a rejection letter for a manuscript, right? That falls into my inbox later that morning. And so a lot of our literature doesn't really take this perspective of understanding kind of how stressors relate to one another. We really wanted to understand this pileup and how pileup from day to day affects our health as well as the health of our family members. And so we looked at parents and adolescent children and looked at how this pileup relates to a variety of different kind of strain outcomes, cortisol regulation, as well as sleep quality and quantity, as well as physical symptoms. And so we had a lot of different analyses, right? Looking within person, looking across the parent-child dyad, looking within day, looking, at the person level, sort of across days on average. What we basically found is that from day to day, there's not really a lot of relationship between stressor pileup and these different strain outcomes. We did see that as we experience more stressor pileup, both parents and adolescents feel more aches and pains on a given day. And that's within person, right? So if I, as a parent, experience more pileup, I experience more aches and pains. If my adolescent experiences more pileups, they experience more aches and pains. We did also see some surprising relationships. So as my stressors pile up as a parent, right, my adolescent kids at first seem to sleep less, but then as we get to sort of more extreme levels of pileup, they actually sleep more. And we found the same relationship from adolescent to parent. So as adolescent sleep piles up, parents at first, their sleep gets less. And then as it gets to more extreme levels, their sleep is longer.
Okay, wait. So let me stop you there because I feel like there's already some really cool findings. I just want to make sure I'm understanding the right way. So the first part about more aches and pains, when you say, like, the more pileup I experience, the more aches and pains, that's not just the more stress that I have, the more aches and pains I have, right? It's not that people who are have more stress in their lives have more aches and pains. There's something unique about, like, these stressors happening together. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So we did also see, like, parents who just have more stressors, right, experience more aches and pains. But this is day to day, right? So, like, relative to like essentially like an average day, right? If I have more stressors piling up that day and in previous days, because we looked across days, if I have more stressors piling up, I tend to feel achier and more pain than usual than my average.
Oh, so if I'm already like super stressed, I've got a lot on my plate, but yesterday I had more than normal on my plate, and then today I have even more than that on my plate, right? That's like now adding to each other on top of my average, and that's what's predicting above and beyond sort of like my average level.
Yes, right. So like day to day, as my stressors pile up, I feel achier. And it's not just sort of being exposed to stress in general. It is really like the day to day pile up. So we didn't find that straightforward relationship with any other strain variable. Again, sleep was this sort of curvilinear thing where it gets worse as things start to pile up, but then as things get really extreme, we actually sleep longer. And then with cortisol, we actually found better regulation as stressors piled up for parents only, not for adolescents.
What does that mean? What does better regulation mean for cortisol? What is cortisol?
Yeah. So cortisol is a hormone that's released by our bodies each and every day. We release it in this daily pattern, right? So cortisol peaks about 30 minutes after we wake up. It basically decreases throughout the rest of the day, right? There's like a little bump-ish, midday-ish. But then it goes down throughout the rest of the day into the wee hours of the morning until we start to wake up again, and then it increases again, right? So there's this sort of like daily slope of cortisol release that our body has. We also know that cortisol is released when we feel stressed out, right? It's kind of like a mobilizing hormone. And so there's lots of work showing that when we're more stressed out, we secrete more cortisol, right? We have more daily output. We have, that slope from morning until evening is shallower. But we actually found as stressors pile up, that slope gets steeper. So indicating like better cortisol regulation as stressors pile up from day to day, only in parents.
Huh. Wild. And so you did say that you found like parent to child relationships, right? So as the parents' stressors are piling up, so they have these stressors happening like back to back above and beyond their regular stressor, that's when you're seeing the kids have the curvilinear relationship with sleep. So like they're
Correct.
At first sleeping less and then start sleeping more. I don't know, maybe to avoid their parents.
Yeah, we think there is some kind of, especially with sleep, right? You probably can't just like keep getting shorter and shorter and shorter sleep. And this has been talked about in the stress literature, right? We have all these theories that say, well, things get worse when we experience stress. But at some point, our body has to probably reach some level of like, okay, but I need to function. And so we think that's what might be happening here, right? So when we're kind of stressed out, when things start piling up, sure, we get less and less sleep, but at some point it has to end, right? And our body has to sort of try and recuperate. And so we think that's why at these sort of extreme levels of pileup, we're actually seeing longer sleep because we cannot just keep decreasing, right?
You know, that reminds me, this is like a very weird deep cut into like personality literature of this thing called transmarginal inhibition, which is basically like if you are introverted, as stimulation increases, your body gets like more and more aroused. And then at some point, your body hits a threshold and says, you know what, this is not safe anymore. I cannot keep getting more aroused, and starts like responding with decreased arousal, and like you drop down. And so it's like why some people who are particularly introverted drink too much coffee, they get sleepy, right? Or you go to a party and you're introverted and you're like, I just need to go home and like lay in bed. Whereas like an extrovert, that threshold is like a lot higher. You can get more and more, and eventually you might reach it, but not necessarily. And so I wonder if that's what's happening here. Is like at first you're responding appropriately, mobilizing those resources to deal with the stressors or whatever. And then like you're saying, at some point your body's just like, nope, we need to like now protect ourselves and avoid. And sleep is a great way to do that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly how we interpreted that pattern. And one of the reasons why in this paper, one of the main contributions is actually exploring these nonlinear patterns between strain and pileup, because it doesn't make sense that as we pile up, we just keep getting worse and worse and worse and worse, right? At some point, we have to get better. But I think, one of the things that we don't know or don't have a really strong grasp on is where is that point? What does it look like? How do we even study it, right? Because in order to study where that point is, we need this sort of methodology where we're looking across time as things happen in succession. And I think we are just starting within the last, maybe 10, 15 years to really develop the methodologies and frameworks to both ask and answer those questions.
And I know I interrupted you. Was there any other cool findings from this study that we didn't talk about?
I think one of the most interesting findings for me was just the contrast between the day-to-day results and the results when we're looking at comparing people, right? So people who have lots of stress versus people who don't have lots of stress pile up. And when we compare people, we see results that are much more consistent with the broader literature, right? Adults and adolescents who experience more stressor events throughout the course of the study, right, have more aches and pains, have worse sleep, have less sleep. There's lots of evidence of crossover. So parents who have lots of work stressors, right, their kids are getting poorer quality sleep, for example. So a lot of the results that we hypothesized play out when we're looking across people. But again, when we look day to day, most relationships actually were not significant. And only one, right, only that physical symptom relationship within person, that was the only one that was significant and consistent with our hypothesis. So day to day, I think our theories just don't generalize as well. And it's not really clear why necessarily they don't. But I think that's the most interesting part.
To me, what that sounds like is actually like a evidence-based criticism of the practice of like well-being and like well-being influencing of, it sounds like these relationships are really between people. You are someone who has a lot on your plate, or you are someone who reacts to stress, or you're in a stressful environment versus you're not. But all of like the well-being apps and influencers are like, well, here's what you can do day to day. Like, here's what you do when a stressor arises. And like, surely, obviously, that's helpful, but only when you make that like a pattern or a habit, or you make systematic changes. It sounds like, at least in the study that you found with the variables that you looked at, that day-to-day part, there's not a whole lot going on in the moment. We're relatively, it sounds like, resilient in the moment. It's these between-person things that require a lot more effort and a lot more change. There's no quick fix. When we see those relationships at the between-person level, when you're comparing people, but we don't see them within person, that's what I think of.
I would agree that it does seem like sort of more chronic exposure. And this is consistent with lots of other literature as well, including some work done with by my awesome colleague, Claire Smith, right? It's really chronic exposure that has sort of the bigger, more consistent effects than within person sort of intervention or stressor exposure. I think we just adapt. We're adaptive people. And I think that is where our theories are going sort of awry, or where we haven't fully thought things out or incorporated things, right? Because the theories don't really talk about adaptation so much. And so I think we need to think more carefully about that.
It kind of reminds me of like, on the daily stressor side of things, it might be uncomfortable, but it's not necessarily dangerous. Yeah. It's when you're experiencing it constantly, those like repeated hits. Now that's when you're starting to get into like the dangerous zone.
Correct. And that's what we were trying to get at with this pile up. But even again, looking within person, pile up, right? Not nearly as strong or consistent as just looking at sort of overall stressor exposure throughout the study.
Yeah. So if I'm an employer, what should I do with this? Or a policymaker?
Yeah, so we also focus on our practical implications are also focused largely on sort of chronic exposure, because that is where we saw a lot more consistent relationships. We would suggest, the importance of breaks for employees, the importance of giving employees autonomy that allows them to change their work circumstances as needed, right? To kind of cut pile up off before it really starts becoming a thing, or to reduce sort of overall chronic workloads with things like flexibility, things like autonomy, or decision latitude at work, right? Being able to decide what you work on, where you work on it, when you work on it, we think are important. We saw crossover effects, right? Even at that between person level, especially. So parents' work affects adolescents, and adolescents' stressors affect their parents, right? So I think we also talk a little bit about, the importance of like family functioning and family counseling, right? If there's a lot going on at home, making sure that the family has the resources they need in order to take care of that, both for the adolescent's health and the parent's health as well.
Super cool. Well, I know that normally I wrap this up with, why do you do this work? But we've already answered that question last time I had you here. So if you had a magic wand and could change like one thing about workplaces in general, what would that be? What is the one thing you would do?
Okay, so what we know from the stress literature broadly and the occupational health literature is that control really matters and controllability really matters. So I think my answer is twofold.
Okay.
Both linked to controllability. One is allowing workers autonomy, right? The autonomy to say no, the autonomy to rearrange. And this would be magic wandy, right? By like some positions, like you just can't change when or where you work necessarily. And that I think creates problems, right? Not having control makes things more stressful. I think my second answer related to this would be sort of decent guaranteed wages, because we know that money is a really important resource, and there's a lot of research showing like financial stress is something that's uncontrollable. Because it's uncontrollable, it produces a lot of negative effects for workers. Money is a resource that can be used in a lot of different ways to get workers themselves help and to just feel, better about their circumstances, more capable to handle when things happen. And so I think money is inherently tied to that control. And especially when we're thinking about work and family, right? And how the two worlds sort of cross over, I think you cannot ignore the importance of the role of money in that process as a resource that puts things squarely within your control.
I love that. Thank you. Thanks for answering my question, and thanks for sharing your study with us.
You're very welcome.
Bye.
Bye.
Healthy Work is a podcast written and executive produced by Keaton Fletcher and Mariana Arvon. This episode is produced, mixed, and edited by Keaton Fletcher. Artwork is by Keaton Fletcher, and our music is Zero, Microsong by Steve Combs. Please like us, follow us, and subscribe on whatever podcatching software you use, and please leave a review on the iTunes Store. It really does help get us out there.
But not really bye, because we're just here in our home, in our closet.
Okay.